The DNP is not just a PhD light. A lot of people who don't fully understand the DNP because it's so new think of it that way, but it's a different way of rounding out that circle. You know, one of the biggest things we've heard in nursing school, and we continue to hear in practice, right, is it takes anywhere from 15 to 20 years for knowledge in the literature to reach practice in a significant way. The DNP was designed to speed that up. We don't want the best practice in the literature to take 15 years. We want it to take 1 or 2 at best.
You're listening to the Oncology Nursing Podcast, where ONS Voices talk cancer, a resource from the Oncology Nursing Society. Through conversations with subject matter experts, we examine the important issues in oncology nursing, from new treatments to patient-centered research to advancements in clinical practice. Join us as we hear from nurses in all facets of oncology care, from bench to bedside and everywhere in between. Welcome to the Oncology Nursing Podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Oncology Nursing Podcast. I'm your host, Jaime Weimer, Manager of Oncology Nursing Practice at ONS. And today we're talking with James Simmons, acute care nurse practitioner at Epic Medical Group in Los Angeles, California, and founder of drjamesqsimmons.com, about innovative ways that DNP and PhD-prepared nurses are collaborating to advance patient care. As a reminder, you can earn free NCPD contact hours after listening to this episode and completing the evaluation we've linked in the episode notes. Thanks so much for joining us today, James.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Wonderful. So to start things off, can you explain the differences between PhD and DNP prepared nurses and what their roles are in dissemination of research?
Ooh, yes. I love this question among the many. So I tend to be kind of a straight shooter and a simple talker. So those listening, I hope that is okay, that you will not get the most scientific and, ivory tower sounding answer to a lot of these questions.
Perfect.
And I think people really relate to things that way, right? It sort of helps them make sense. So PhD nurses at their very core are nurses who have a PhD, obviously, and their core is in developing new knowledge. So finding deficits in the literature, so in the research, and saying, no one's ever done anything about this. No one's ever investigated this from a research standpoint. So generating new knowledge. DNP, Doctorate of Nursing Practice, prepared nurses are individuals who take the research, understand the research on a really sort of like molecular level, if you will, understand the research as good as a PhD in many ways, and then are able to take the best practices from the research and apply them sort of in the real world, if you will, apply them in practice. Now, this is not to say that both types of doctoral degrees don't cross over, because they totally do. There are plenty of PhD nurses who not only generate new knowledge in the literature, but then also apply that in practice. There are plenty of DNP prepared nurses who are parts of groups who generate new knowledge. So they certainly cross over, but the focus for PhD nurses is generation of new knowledge, really digging into new research on topics that have not been explored, versus DNP nurses, prepared nurses, really want to take the knowledge that's in the literature, kind of amalgamate it all together, if you will, find the best practices, and then go apply that in the real world and see if it actually works.
Perfect. That's a really helpful breakdown of the differences of those two. And I think that will be helpful for our listeners. I mean, I've been a nurse for 18 years and, the DNP sort of became popular. It sort of, I think, gained traction and notoriety, I would say, in the past 10 years. It seems that it has really become more prolific, more programs available. And so I think many nurses were probably familiar with the PhD track, but the DNP has sort of come of age recently. So I really appreciate you breaking down those differences for us.
Absolutely. And I want to, I will probably say this multiple times during our chat, but I do think it's really important for people to understand those differences and know that the DNP is not just a PhD light. A lot of people who don't fully understand the DNP because it's so new think of it that way, especially because it doesn't generally take as long as a PhD, but it's a different way of rounding out that circle. One of the biggest things we've heard in nursing school, and we continue to hear in practice, right, is it takes anywhere from 15 to 20 years for knowledge in the literature to reach practice in a significant way. So the DNP was designed to speed that up. We don't want the best practice in the literature to take 15 years. We want it to take 1 or 2 at best.
Absolutely.
So that's why DNPs are not just a PhD light, but rather helping complete that circle really at the ultimate behest of our patients.
Now that we have some of that background on, the differences between PhDs and DNPs, let's talk a little bit how they work together, which you already kind of alluded to. Can you explain why collaboration between these two groups is so important, especially as it relates to our rapidly changing healthcare system?
Rapidly changing healthcare system. You nailed it right there. That is really the reason, because sometimes in order to do quality generation of new knowledge, generation of new research for PhDs, they're not able to be as boots on the ground, if you will, or in touch with what is going on in practice. At the same time, DNPs or nurses who may be more in touch with what's going on in the day-to-day practice haven't had the best avenues in the past to get that information back up to PhDs. So now we've got doctorally prepared experts on both sides, if you will, generating the new knowledge and out in practice, executing that new knowledge, evaluating it with really, really detailed, doctorally prepared eyes. And then they're able to give that data back to the PhDs to go say, all right, now we need to research this, right? That sort of Storyland, perfect textbook world of what we want this to look like and why it is so important for the two groups they really should be symbiotic. In my perfect world, there's a PhD and a DNP working on every single project, right? That they're just the unique individual skills that each brings and the perspective that each brings is the way that we change that 15 to 20 year gap. It is the way that we take on and lead the change in healthcare in that rapidly changing healthcare system, because nurses are expertly and perfectly positioned to be the leaders in AI, right? And technology and reduction in workforce and robotics and all these different things that are happening in our healthcare system right now. I think we are primed to be the leaders of that, not just the ones reacting to it. And I think we become the leaders of that by having really, really eloquent, really fine-tuned PhD and DNP collaboration.
I love that. And even in a recent ONS Voice article, you helped describe building this community of DNPs and PhDs at UCLA. What brought about your desire to create such a community?
Well, it certainly wasn't just my desire all alone. I definitely have to give some love to Dr. Cheryl LaHouque, who is my partner in, crime's not the right word. I don't know. Partner in, dissemination of knowledge.
There you go.
She's my partner, and really my entire cohort. We were part of the first cohort of DNPs at UCLA. We started in 2018. We finished in the middle of 2020, which I don't know if you knew there was something going on in June of 2020. Yeah.
That old thing.
Just that old thing. But one of the things that really struck us during that time were, we're working through sort of our theoretical models for our own particular scholarly projects and reading research and reading other dissertations and reading things like that. And there was this sort of like conceptual models of nursing practice in a reciprocal relationship. And so this was one of the sort of theoretical models that we came off of. And I believe it's Jacqueline Farrell, if I remember right, a PhD. But just identify goals and purposes, the method through learning and implementation strategies, setting priorities, managing time, a social environment, physical environment, performance. And it goes back up to motive. Like it's this circle that we sort of like, we're drilled into our heads a little bit from this theoretical model. And looking at that model and other aspects of the leadership for our project, we were like, okay, there's a little bit of talk out there in the literature about how great it would be for PhD and DNP nurses to work together, and a little bit of evidence of what happens when the two groups really do work together. So projects that people had worked on at generally large academic institutions that were sort of, people can think of them as quality improvement projects, but they're really on such a different, so much more expansive level. And they really moved the needle for these organizations. But we didn't see a lot of that. There were literally like 2 examples in the literature at the time. So Dr. LaHouque and I were like, all right, we're some babies in school. We're finishing our DNP. We don't even know what the other PhDs at USC, UCLA are doing right now. Turns out some of them were working on research projects that were close to the scholarly projects that we as DNPs were working on. And we're like, hold on, we got to come up with a way to get everyone together so that we at least know what the heck each other are doing and we can support one another, that we can be the quick executors of an idea. We can give data back. We can help analyze that data. We can help design research for our PhD colleagues. We can do all of these things together with a shared focus and a shared motivation. And we just didn't see that really anywhere, and including at UCLA at the time. So we were like, we got to create a community here.
That's amazing. And, it strikes me as that, the relationship really should start in sort of the academic world, right? Connecting the DNPs and PhDs while still in school, while not even fully graduated yet, to understand the importance of creating that, as you said, symbiotic relationship between the two, because it extends into real world and practice. Post-graduation, that work continues for both of those tracks. And so being able to set up that relationship early on, I think only just sort of ingrains and hardwires that for the duration of practice after graduation.
That was certainly the goal. That's what we were hoping for. But, something like this is kind of I think it's only in its infancy, because the DNP, especially now that, we have sort of the AACN has revised their DNP essentials into what I think are kind of more robust but yet detailed at the same time essentials of what the DNP is. I think because we're now sort of on like 2.0, 3.0 of that, and we're understanding the power and influence of the DNP and how it can be in such symbiotic relationship with PhDs. But it's only been around for 15, 20 years, right? So I think that's why it feels so infant, and why we're just really excited to have taken the old college try, pun intended, at getting together some type of collaboration so that we can lay the groundwork so that PhD and DNPs going forward are like, okay, well, my program literally must consist of how am I going to work with either PhDs or DNPs, and learning that in school so that, like you said, it is part of practice going forward.
So as part of this sort of community building that you did at UCLA, part of that included these organized kind of regular meetings among DNPs and PhDs. Can you describe what the structure of those meetings were like and kind of what happened at them?
A big old party. Well, no, not quite. So the very first one, we were trying to come up with creative ways of connecting PhD and DNPs in a way that didn't feel like it was just an extension of work, right? In a way that didn't feel like it was just, oh my gosh, I have to be in another meeting. I have to do another presentation. I have to do another thing that feels so heavy and burdensome. Rather, let's make it fun and light, get the conversation going and build from there. So speed dating is the idea that we came up with. Obviously, we did not invent speed dating, but we decided we wanted to speed date PhDs, students, and those who had already finished, as well as DNPs, students, and those who had already finished their DNPs. So we initially started with speed dating just folks at UCLA. And our very first speed dating event was, March 10th or 11th of 2020, I think. I'm in California, and, I think we shut down on March 13th for COVID.
Right.
So the timing of that was not great. In fact, we had 30% of people drop out before, this was before any of us really knew what was going on. But we had this great meeting, and we had 30 people in this room all speed dating each other. So they were told beforehand to bring sort of their 30-second elevator pitch, bring their business cards, either electronic or in person, bring what they're looking for, bring a fun attitude. We did it during a happy hour. We provided food and drink. It was at a great restaurant just right off campus at UCLA. And it was highly successful. People really got into seeing what everyone else was doing. And there were connections made in that very first meeting. In fact, there were two, and I don't recall the exact specifics, but there were two individuals who were focused on a pediatric populations, both working on like vaccine initiatives in marginalized and underserved communities. And they had no idea that each other had existed. Incredible contacts were made from that, sort of in-person meeting. And then we just moved it online, if you will, afterwards, and turned it into a quarterly and monthly meetings after that.
That's amazing. So can you give us any examples of what kind of research or projects have come out of those meetings and any success stories to share?
Yeah, I think that very first one right there were several people in that who, had projects that they were working on that they did not realize that there was a PhD also working on, or a DNP working on, right? Their colleague counterpart. One of the ones that struck so significantly for us, so we carried on with quarterly meetings. Now, obviously during COVID in 2020 and 2021, we didn't do anything in person. But then after that, we had our second and third in-person, they're sort of annual at this point, annual in-person gatherings. And at one of those gatherings, we had an individual who is a PhD-prepared nurse leader who is a veteran himself and works a lot on veterans' health initiatives, particularly around mental health and access to resources through the VA, but then also not through the VA. We had a DNP student at the time, who is also a veteran and was working on access to mental health in sort of online forums for unhoused veterans. And those two individuals met at this meeting. And at the meeting, we required everyone to do a little 20-second little video intro so we could pop it on a website and say, hey, this is what this person's doing in video. And it was during the recording of those videos that the two of them looked at each other and they were like, wait a minute, you're a veteran. Hold on, you're a veteran. Oh my gosh, you're working on this. You're working on this. They sent us what amounted to a strategic business plan a week later. They had already met. They sent a plan and they were like, this is what we plan to do. This is how the DNP, gentleman's going to be involved. This is how the PhD and gentleman's going to be involved. They actually were at two different schools at the time. So one of the PhD was at a rival school to UCLA, but we had expanded by that point. So there were really, really fantastic opportunities like that. Even within the UCLA healthcare system, there were DNPs doing not their full projects, but sort of like quality improvement projects in, UCLA consists of several hospitals. So they were working on quality improvement projects at their respective hospital. And the hospital, 2 miles down the road was considering doing the same thing. So they were already there ready to share best practices, how far they had gone, mistakes learned, things like that. So even within the intra UCLA health system, there were fantastic connections made. And it was really, every time we meet, it's really fruitful.
That's amazing. And it just strikes me as you just mentioned, these gaps, these sort of missed connections, if you will, it can happen within a system, a singular system, just because our health systems are getting so big. So, whether it's geographically spread out or just, everyone's sort of in their own little specialty world, sometimes it's hard to break through that. But not only that, but as you mentioned, it can even cross systems so that whether it's you're in the same city or in the same state, having these opportunities to connect and talk about, shared interests and shared research can help sort of bridge those gaps and those silos between or within organizations to really make sure that everyone's efforts are sort of funneled and channeled in the same direction, creating that synergy that really helps, as you mentioned, expedite results and help get them into the real world.
And I think it's something that the real world, speaking of, is moving so fast right now, right? There's just so much going on. Politically, I know we're not talking politics here, but I think you can't ignore the political landscape and how it impacts healthcare. I could not talk enough about how I think AI is really going to dramatically change the healthcare system in the next 10 years. There are really so many things coming. And I think now, because so many PhD and DNP prepared nurses are leaders at their various organizations, healthcare systems, in academia, nurses like me who are out there sort of in the media and doing that type of thing. In the past, I think had been some not bad blood. That's not the right way to say it at all. But I think there was just some misunderstandings about sort of PhDs and misunderstandings about DNPs. And I think now we don't have time to worry about that anymore. And I think these newer generations of doctorally prepared nurses are sort of moving beyond that. They're sort of moving beyond any stigma with the particular degrees and moving towards we really have to work together as a profession and as leaders in a profession to prepare us for this, not only prepare, but I think lead us in what is coming in this, super, super aggressively changing healthcare structure in the next, 10 to 15 years.
So what advice would you give to nurses, whether they're DNPs, PhDs, or even direct care nurses who want to start a program like the one that you've described?
Oh, like the collaboration sort of thing?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Here's my advice. Do it because we need it. Just know that it's a lot of work. But I think it's really rewarding work. It's been something that I've truly enjoyed. You have to have sort of your eyes really open to different ways of doing things. I think some of the colleagues that we worked with initially were like, really? You want me to send a flyer to a bunch of doctorally prepared nurses and say about speed dating? They were just like, where's the evidence around speed dating, right? It was just, everyone sort of kind of gets bogged down in that. And I think we've got to think about how we approach our own profession in service of our patients and the communities that we serve. We've got to think about things differently. And I think that we as nurses are the ones to do that. We are in such a sweet spot where we can be innovators and we can be quick thinkers because we are. And we're so highly educated and so highly experienced as a profession that we've got to take as much of this knowledge as we can and share it with everyone and figure out what the best practices are going to be like this. So I think whether you are doctorally prepared, master's prepared, bachelor's prepared, associate prepared, it doesn't matter. We need your voice and we need your work And we need your perspective on how we prepare our healthcare systems to be at best service for our patients and communities going forward. So start something like this, start small, be consistent, know that you're going to make mistakes and that those mistakes are not only just okay, but they're actually imperative for you to continue to create and develop such rich, meaningful, larger scale programming that we all dream of to really increase collaboration across nurses and nursing specialties and the interdisciplinary health team.
So what advice would you give to nurses who maybe want to pursue research as a career path?
Don't be scared. It can be scary, right? You're like, I don't want to deal with statistics anymore. I don't want to power this and the N of that and all of this stuff. And what does it mean? All of that is really scary to some people. I think what's really important about that is that it is important for you to know those things, but that's not all that research is. And you can really affect change. I'd like to talk about the fact that we vaccinate young people now. The vaccination for HPV starts at age 11 and goes up now through age 45. And that is because of the research leadership of a nurse. And that changed the world. And so we know that people who have ovaries and cervixes are at higher rates of cancers later on in life with HPV. We know that certain populations are as much as 8 times higher risk of anal cancer if they have uncleared HPV and they've been unvaccinated. And so now we are seeing reductions in those cancers in certain populations because of this vaccine. The research on that vaccine was led by a nurse. Like, you can change the world by going into research. You can change the world by going into generation of new knowledge as a PhD, or dissemination and practicality, implementation science as a DNP, and still practice, by the way. There are plenty of people who are in that research world, but they also still practice or go back and forth between the two. So don't be scared of it. If you've got these big ideas that you want to really influence the world and change the world, and you're like, no one is doing this, I think I've got a pretty good idea about how to do it well. The nursing research, PhD and DNP community really, really needs you to step up and be a leader in that.
That's perfect. Great advice. Don't let a couple of stats courses scare you away from making your great ideas reach the world.
It's true. And those courses are scary, let me tell you, but just get a buddy and...
Well, right. Yeah, exactly. You're not alone in those, and even those difficult courses. And great advice, because I think you're right. I think many people might even stop short of even trying because it does feel very overwhelming, very intimidating. So I love that advice of just don't be scared.
Absolutely.
Well, James, thank you so much for talking with us today and sharing your experiences with the DNP and PhD Collaborative. I think this is just a great idea and a topic for nurses to consider about how this might be implemented at their own site of care. As we reach the end of our episode today, we do like to run through a series of quickfire questions just to help summarize some of the things that we've talked about today. So to start that off, how do you think healthcare professionals should evaluate their hidden or maybe their implicit bias about the roles of DNPs and PhDs and how they can collaborate?
Ooh, talk to one of each. Reach out. Do not be scared to blindly reach out to a PhD or a DNP that you admire. You've read some of their work. They are at your workplace. You don't even know them. You see them on TV. Doesn't matter. Just reach out. 99% of us are very open and ready to talk about what we're working on. I promise you. And you may have a really different perspective after speaking with a PhD or a DNP about what they actually do day to day. And it can absolutely change your own perspective once you talk to them.
What are some common misconceptions about DNP and PhD nursing roles?
I think the DNP, I mentioned this earlier, but I think it's worth mentioning again that one of the common misconceptions about the DNP is that it's just a PhD light. It's different. It's not a PhD light. And I think that's really important to acknowledge. I think it's also really important to acknowledge that PhD nurses are not just our friends in the ivory towers who don't practice and haven't seen the inside of a clinic or, listen to a patient's lung sounds in 38 years. Sure, there are some of those PhD nurses that exist right now and we need them. They play a valuable role, but that's not all that being a PhD nurse means. There are plenty of PhD nurses who are doing really incredible things in the grind, in the hustle on a day-to-day basis. So don't let your internal biases about this PhD who maybe taught you in school 30 years ago, that's the only route to a career as being a PhD nurse.
What's something about this topic that's not often discussed, but you wish people knew more about?
That you kind of like having an RN, the world is sort of your oyster. You're writing, hosting a podcast as an RN. Like a lot of people, I do a ton of media. I was on TV 3 times last week. Like there's so many things that you can do as a nurse, and particularly as a doctorally prepared nurse, DNP or PhD, that I don't think people really open their minds to or even know exist. Just, kind of like the example I said earlier, like people think, oh, PhD, great. I'm going to do this 7-year-long research project. I'm not going to have a life for 7 years, and then I'm going to go teach. And that's it. Well, you can if you want. I know a lot of people who do that and they loved every minute of it and they love teaching. But if you don't want to teach, you don't have to teach. And you can still be a really highly successful, impactful PhD nurse, right? So like, I think it's important to know that getting this doctorally prepared as a nurse opens up not only doors, it opens up stadiums full of doors that you did not even know existed beforehand.
I think you're absolutely right. I think we always have these preconceived notions in our heads of what these degrees equate to or result in. And I think in the same way, when I went back for my master's, like I didn't know what I'd do with it, but I just knew that it would give me more opportunities to do more things. And so I think that's great advice.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
What additional training or education, aside from the programs themselves, do oncology nurses need to stay current on just kind of what is new and happening with doctorally prepared nurses?
Ooh, that's tough. I mean, read, right? Read your publication, listen to podcasts like this. I think, listen, I live in Los Angeles, so I drive everywhere, right? This is all we do. We're like spend our lives in our cars. So I have like 1,000 podcasts that I listen to constantly to keep myself up to date on what's going on. I think things like that are really, really, really important. You don't have to feel like, oh my gosh, I have to sit down and read a textbook about how to stay on top of things like this. In the world of oncology, so immunotherapies, obviously medication therapies, alternative therapies, things like that are changing so incredibly fast. Like, whoa, it's wild how fast they're changing. And I think it's really imperative for nurses at every level, regardless of degree, to try to stay on top of what our patients know about those medications. So I saw this on a TV commercial and I want you to give it to me, right? Or am I one of the 18 cancers that can be treated by Keytruda, or why not? Things like that. So putting our patient's hat on while we comb through the research, while we use AI to help us, give us a synopsis of research, things like that is really, really important for the particular patient populations that we serve, because we're here for the patients. I think it's important that we understand their perspective as well as our own.
Absolutely sound advice. Well, James, thank you so much again for your time and sharing your experiences with us today. Do you have any final comments to share with our listeners?
Just a big thank you for everything that everyone does. I think one of my final thoughts is that you can contribute to the evidence. In fact, you do. You contribute to the evidence. You contribute to literature. You contribute to changing practice. You contribute to preparing nursing for the future with or without being doctorally prepared. I encourage everyone, I'm a school person, right? Like I love school. I also love practice. I love all the 14,000 things that I do with my DNP. So if you're one of those people, don't be scared of it. Don't be scared of the money. There's ways to figure that out too. Just also know that you don't have to be a DNP or a PhD to make meaningful contributions to advancing nursing practice. But if you do decide to go down that road, it has just been unbelievable and simply the best thing I've ever done for my career.
Thank you so much again for your time today, James.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Oncology Nursing Podcast. Tell us about your favorite part in this episode by leaving a review wherever you download your podcast. For more resources and information about oncology nursing, visit us at ons.org or voice.ons.org. The ideas and opinions shared in this episode represent those of the guest and not necessarily ONS.